I was sitting on my back porch with a cold beer when I saw her marching across my lawn like she owned the place, clipboard in hand, and a scowl that could curdle milk. It was Tuesday afternoon in late spring, and I had just gotten home from my construction job in Boulder, Colorado, ready to relax after a 10-hour day. The woman striding toward me was Patricia Morrison, the newly elected president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association, and from the look on her face, this was not going to be a friendly visit. Mr. Bernard Young. She called out before she even reached my porch, her voice sharp and officious. "That's me," I said, setting down my beer and standing up. I was still in my work clothes, dusty jeans and a flannel shirt, boots caked with dried mud. "What can I do for you?" Patricia stopped at the bottom of my porch steps, holding up her clipboard like it was a weapon. She was probably in her early 50s, with highlighted blonde hair styled in that soccer mom cut and wearing a pastel pink cardigan despite the warm weather. "I'm here on official HOA business. I've been conducting property inspections throughout the neighborhood, and I need to inform you that you have multiple violations on your property." I felt my jaw tighten. I had lived in this house for 3 years, ever since my grandfather passed away and left it to me in his will. Before that, my grandfather had lived here since 1962, when the house was built. The neighborhood had changed a lot over the decades, becoming more upscale, but this house had been in my family for over 60 years. "What kind of violations?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She flipped through papers on her clipboard with dramatic flair. "First, your lawn has dandelions, which are considered weeds per Section 4.2 of the HOA bylaws. Second, your fence needs repainting. And third, and most importantly, that shed in your backyard is not in compliance with current regulations. It exceeds the allowed square footage by approximately 40 square feet. It's too close to the property line, and it was never approved by the Architectural Review Committee." I stared at her in disbelief. "That shed has been there since 1965. My grandfather built it himself." "That may be," Patricia said, her tone suggesting she didn't care about the history, "but it doesn't meet current HOA standards. You have 30 days to remove it or face daily fines of $100. "Wait a minute," I said, feeling heat rise in my chest. "This is a grandfathered structure. The HOA wasn't even established until 2005, and that shed was here 40 years before that. You can't just demand I tear it down." Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. "The HOA has the authority to enforce compliance on all structures within the community boundaries, regardless of when they were built. If you have documentation proving it's grandfathered, you can present it at the next HOA meeting. Until then, the violation stands. You'll receive a formal notice in the mail within 3 business days." She turned on her heel and walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with my blood pressure rising and 1,000 angry thoughts racing through my mind. That shed wasn't just some random outbuilding. It held decades of my family's history, tools that had belonged to my grandfather, memories of him teaching me woodworking as a kid during summer visits. The structure itself was solid as a rock, built with the kind of craftsmanship you didn't see anymore, with hand-cut beams and a cedar shake roof that my grandfather had replaced twice over the years. I pulled out my phone and called my buddy Derek, who worked in real estate law over in Denver. After explaining the situation, he let out a low whistle. "Man, that's rough. But you're right about the grandfathering. If that structure predates the HOA and you can prove it, they can't force you to remove it. You need to dig up documentation, though. Property records, old photos, anything that shows it's been there since before the HOA existed." "I know my grandfather kept everything," I said. There's boxes of papers in the attic. I just need to find them. Do it fast, Derek advised. And don't miss that HOA meeting. These people can make your life miserable if you let them. That evening, I climbed up into the attic, a cramped space that smelled like old wood and dust. My grandfather had been meticulous about keeping records, and I found what I was looking for in a set of cardboard boxes labeled by decade. In the box marked 1960s, I discovered the original building permit for the shed, dated March 1965, along with a hand-drawn site plan showing its exact location. There were also dozens of photographs, including several showing my grandfather constructing the shed with a friend, and later photos of him using it as his workshop. I also found the original property deed and a survey from 1962. The shed was clearly marked on a 1968 survey that my grandfather had commissioned when he considered adding a pool. Everything I needed was right there, proving beyond any doubt that the structure was legal and predated the HOA by 4 decades. The HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening at the community center, a modern building near the neighborhood entrance. I showed up 15 minutes early with a folder full of documentation, copies made of everything just in case. The meeting room was already filling up with residents, most of them retirees or young families. Patricia sat at the front table with 2 other board members, a thin man in his 60s named Harold, and a woman about Patricia's age named Denise. The meeting started with standard business, approval of last month's minutes, discussion of landscaping contracts, debate over whether to install speed bumps on Maple Street. I sat through it all, waiting for my turn. Finally, after nearly an hour, Patricia looked at her agenda and said, "Next item, property violations. We have several outstanding issues to address." She went through a list of minor infractions around the neighborhood, and then she got to mine. Property at 847 Oakwood Drive, owned by Bernard Young. Multiple violations including weed growth, fence maintenance, and an unpermitted structure that exceeds size regulations. I raised my hand. I'd like to address that. Patricia looked annoyed. You'll have your chance during the public comment period. This directly concerns my property, I said firmly. I have documentation that proves the shed is a legal, grandfathered structure. There was murmuring around the room. Patricia exchanged glances with Harold and Denise, then nodded curtly. You have 5 minutes. I stood up and walked to the front, opening my folder. The shed on my property was built in March of 1965 by my grandfather, Thomas Young, who owned the house from 1962 until his death in 2020. I have the original building permit here, issued by Boulder County. I held up the yellow document. I also have property surveys from 1962 and 1968 that clearly show the shed's location. There are photographs documenting its construction, and showing it has been maintained continuously for nearly 60 years. I passed the documents to Patricia, who looked through them with an expression that shifted from annoyance to frustration. Harold leaned over to examine the papers, his eyes widening. This is a classic grandfathered structure, I continued. It predates the HOA by 40 years. Under Colorado property law, specifically the doctrine of non-conforming use, structures that existed before new regulations cannot be arbitrarily forced into compliance or removed, as long as they're maintained and not substantially altered. Patricia set down the papers. The HOA board will need to review these documents and consult with our attorney before making a determination. There's nothing to determine, I said, keeping my voice level but firm. The law is clear. This shed is legal. It's been continuously maintained and it's not going anywhere. I'm happy to provide these documents for your records, but I'm not removing it and I won't be paying any fines. A man in the audience spoke up. I remember that shed. I've lived here since 1998 and it was already old then. Seems pretty clear-cut to me. An older woman added, Tom Young was a good man. He kept that property immaculate for decades. If the shed's been there that long, why is this even an issue? Patricia's face flushed. The HOA has a responsibility to maintain property values and ensure uniformity in the neighborhood. We can't have structures that don't meet current standards, even when they're legal, I challenged. Because that's what we're talking about. This isn't about whether you like how the shed looks or whether it fits your vision for the neighborhood. It's about whether you have the legal authority to force me to remove it, and you don't. The room erupted in conversation, neighbors turning to each other to discuss the situation. Patricia banged a gavel on the table. Order. We'll take this matter under advisement and respond within 2 weeks. Next item on the agenda. I returned to my seat, adrenaline pumping. Several neighbors gave me approving nods as I passed. After the meeting, a handful of people came up to introduce themselves and share their own HOA horror stories. It seemed Patricia had been making enemies since taking over as president 6 months earlier, enforcing rules with an aggressive zeal that rubbed people the wrong way. 2 weeks passed, and I heard nothing from the HOA. I figured they had consulted their attorney and realized they didn't have a leg to stand on. I was wrong. On a Monday morning, I found an envelope in my mailbox with the HOA logo. Inside was a letter informing me that while the board acknowledged the shed was a pre-existing structure, it had been substantially altered over the years, which negated its grandfathered status. Therefore, the violation stood, and I now owed $1,400 in fines for the 2 weeks that had passed since the meeting. I read the letter 3 times, fury building with each reading. The claim was absurd. My grandfather had maintained the shed carefully, replacing the roof twice and repainting it regularly, but the structure itself hadn't been altered. It was the same footprint, same walls, same foundation. Maintenance wasn't alteration. I called Derek again. They're playing hardball, he said after I read him the letter. They know they're on shaky ground legally, but they're hoping you'll back down rather than fight it. You need to send them a formal response, and you might want to consider getting an attorney who specializes in HOA disputes. This is ridiculous, I said. I shouldn't have to hire a lawyer to protect a shed that's been legally standing for 60 years. You're right, you shouldn't. But that's the reality of dealing with aggressive HOAs. They have funds specifically for legal battles and they'll use them. Derek gave me the name of an attorney in Boulder, a woman named Sarah Chen who had handled several HOA cases. I called her office that afternoon and scheduled a consultation for the next day. Sarah was in her late 30s, sharp and professional, with a reputation for not backing down from fights. In her office, I laid out the entire situation. She reviewed my documentation, nodding as she examined each piece. "You have an excellent case," she said. "This is textbook grandfathering. The maintenance argument is nonsense. Under Colorado law, routine maintenance and even identical replacement of components doesn't constitute substantial alteration. If you replace the roof with the same materials in the same configuration, that's maintenance, not alteration." "So what do we do?" I asked. "First, I'll send them a cease and desist letter, making it clear that their position is legally unfounded and that continued harassment will result in legal action. I'll also demand they rescind the fines. If they don't back down, we can file suit. Given the strength of your documentation, I'd be surprised if this went to court. Most HOA attorneys will advise their clients to drop it rather than face a losing battle and potential counterclaims. Sarah sent the letter that afternoon via certified mail. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders having professional representation. But I should have known Patricia wouldn't give up easily. 3 days later, I came home from work to find a code enforcement officer from Boulder County walking around my property. He introduced himself as Mike Hansen and explained that the HOA had filed a complaint with the county claiming I had unpermitted modifications to my property. "I understand you have a shed that was built in 1965, Mike said, consulting his tablet. "That's right," I said, exhaustion creeping into my voice. "I have all the original permits and documentation. Can I see them?" I brought out my file, which now included copies of everything since I seemed to be showing these documents to someone new every few days. Mike examined them carefully, took photos with his tablet and walked around the shed, taking measurements and more photos. "This all looks in order," he said finally. "The original permit is valid, the structure matches the permitted plans, and I don't see any evidence of substantial modification. I'll file my report with the county. The HOA complaint will be marked as unfounded." "Thank you," I said, relieved. Mike hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "Off the record, you're not the first person from this neighborhood who's had issues with your HOA lately. There's been a pattern of questionable complaints. You might want to document everything, just in case." After he left, I sat on my porch feeling exhausted and angry. This was harassment, pure and simple. Patricia had decided she didn't like my shed, and she was using every tool at her disposal to force me to remove it, regardless of the law. I wondered how many other neighbors she had bullied into compliance. That evening, my phone rang. It was Tom Henderson, a neighbor from 3 streets over whom I had met briefly at the HOA meeting. "Hey Bernard, I heard about the code enforcement visit. Patricia's been bragging about it at the community center." "Of course she has," I muttered. "Listen, there's a group of us who are fed up with her. She's been targeting people left and right, issuing violations for petty things, trying to force expensive upgrades that aren't necessary. We're thinking about organizing a petition to recall her from the board. Are you interested?" "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. Tom explained that under the HOA bylaws, 20% of homeowners could petition for a special election to recall board members. The neighborhood had 312 homes, so they needed signatures from at least 63 homeowners. Tom had been quietly talking to neighbors and already had about 30 people committed. Over the next 2 weeks, I joined the effort, going door to door in the evenings and on weekends. The stories I heard were infuriating. Patricia had fined an elderly couple $500 for having a garden gnome in their front yard, claiming it violated aesthetic standards. She had threatened a young family with daily fines unless they removed a treehouse that had been approved by the previous board. She had issued violations against at least 15 properties for minor issues like mailbox designs or the wrong shade of beige paint. One woman, Gloria Harper, broke down crying as she told me how Patricia had harassed her for months over decorative shutters on her house. "They've been there for 12 years, Gloria said. "The previous board never had a problem, but Patricia says they're not approved in the architectural guidelines. I'm a widow on a fixed income. I can't afford to remove them and repair the siding." By the end of 2 weeks, we had 78 signatures, well over the required threshold. Tom submitted the petition to the HOA board on a Wednesday afternoon. According to the bylaws, the board had to schedule a special election within 45 days. Patricia's response was swift and vindictive. That Friday, I received another letter from the HOA. This time, they were claiming my fence was 6 inches over the property line, encroaching on HOA common area. The letter demanded I move the entire fence or face fines of $200 per day. I looked at the fence, a simple 6-foot privacy fence that ran along the back of my property. It had been there since the 1970s, installed by my grandfather. I pulled out the old property survey from 1968, which clearly showed the fence was well within the property boundaries. I forwarded the letter to Sarah Chen. She called me within an hour. This is retaliatory and likely constitutes harassment. I'm going to file a motion for an injunction and a formal complaint. This has gone beyond a simple property dispute. What does that mean? I asked. It means we're going to ask a judge to order the HOA to stop harassing you while we sort this out. And we're going to make it clear that their pattern of behavior is legally actionable. Sarah filed the paperwork on Monday. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, I had the fence line professionally surveyed. The surveyor confirmed what I already knew. The fence was entirely on my property, actually 18 inches inside the boundary line. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I kept running through everything in my mind, wondering if I had missed anything. At 3 a.m., I went out to the shed with a flashlight. I hadn't spent much time in there recently, focused as I was on the legal battle, but standing inside brought back memories of my grandfather. The shed was organized exactly as he had kept it. Tools hanging on pegboards, a workbench along one wall, shelves holding carefully labeled boxes of screws, nails, and other hardware. On one shelf, I found an old photo album I hadn't noticed before. I took it inside and flipped through it, finding pictures of my grandfather working in the shed over the decades. There were photos from every era. The 1960s showing him building furniture, the 1970s with him repairing bicycles, the 1980s with him teaching my father how to use woodworking tools, the 1990s with him building a dollhouse for my sister's daughter. One photo stopped me cold. It was from 1985, a neighborhood gathering, and it showed dozens of people in someone's backyard. I recognized my grandfather's shed clearly visible in the background. But what caught my attention was a group of people in the foreground, and among them was a young couple. The woman looked familiar, and after a moment I realized why. It was Patricia Morrison, probably 30 years younger, along with a man who must have been her husband. Patricia had lived in this neighborhood before. She knew the shed had been here for decades. This wasn't about regulations or property values. This was personal for some reason I didn't understand. The hearing the next morning was in Boulder County Court. Sarah and I sat at one table, while the HOA was represented by their attorney, a slick-looking man in his 50s named Richard Polk. Patricia was there too, sitting in the gallery with Harold and Denise. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judge Martha Sullivan, reviewed the filings before looking up at both parties. This seems like a fairly straightforward matter. Mr. Polk, your client has issued multiple violations against Mr. Young's property, and Mr. Young contends these are unfounded and retaliatory. Let's start with the shed issue. Sarah presented our documentation. The original 1965 permit, property surveys, photographs spanning 6 decades. The county inspector's report confirming no substantial alterations, and expert testimony from a structural engineer who had examined the shed and confirmed it was the original structure with only routine maintenance performed over the years. Polk tried to argue that replacing the roof twice constituted substantial alteration, but Judge Sullivan cut him off. Replacing a roof with identical materials is standard maintenance. Do you have any evidence of actual structural alteration, such as expansion, reconfiguration, or change in use. The HOA's position is that the structure doesn't meet current standards, Polk said. That's not what I asked. Does it meet the standards that existed when it was built? Yes, but then it's grandfathered. Colorado law is clear on this point. Next issue, the fence. Sarah presented the original property survey and the new survey we had commissioned. As you can see, Your Honor, the fence is entirely within my client's property boundaries. The HOA's claim of encroachment is factually incorrect. Judge Sullivan looked at Polk. Do you have a survey showing otherwise? The HOA board determined through visual inspection that the fence appeared to be over the line, Polk said weakly. Visual inspection is not sufficient for making claims about property boundaries. That's why we have licensed surveyors. Is there anything else? Polk shifted through his papers. The HOA has a responsibility to maintain aesthetic standards in the community. Aesthetic preferences don't override property rights or grandfathered protections, Judge Sullivan said firmly. She looked at both attorneys. I'm issuing an injunction prohibiting the HOA from taking any enforcement action regarding the shed or the fence. Additionally, I'm ordering the HOA to rescind all fines issued against Mr. Young. This appears to be a case of an HOA overreaching its authority and possibly engaging in harassment. If similar complaints come before this court again involving this HOA, I may consider sanctions. Sarah smiled. I felt relief wash over me, but Judge Sullivan wasn't done. I'm also concerned about the pattern of behavior described in the filings. Miss Chen, your brief mentioned multiple other homeowners facing similar issues. Yes, Your Honor. There's currently a petition to recall the HOA board president due to a pattern of aggressive and questionable enforcement actions. Mr. Polk, I suggest you advise your client to carefully review their enforcement policies and ensure they're operating within the bounds of Colorado law and their own bylaws. This kind of overreach can expose an HOA to significant liability. We're adjourned. Outside the courtroom, Sarah shook my hand. That went as well as we could have hoped. You're protected now. If they come after you again, it will look like deliberate harassment and they could face contempt charges. Thank you, I said. Send me your bill, already done. And honestly, this was almost too easy. They had no case and shouldn't have pushed it this far. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in weeks. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw Tom Henderson waiting on my porch with a big grin on his face. I heard you won, he said. News travels fast. This is huge for the recall effort. People are fired up. Over the next 3 weeks, the recall campaign gained momentum. More signatures came in, and a slate of new board candidates emerged, including Tom and Gloria Harper. The special election was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in mid-June. Patricia tried to fight back. She sent out a newsletter to all homeowners claiming the recall effort was being led by malcontents who want to turn the neighborhood into a slum. She held a meeting at the community center where she presented a slideshow of violations she claimed were running rampant in the neighborhood, including several photos of my shed from different angles, as if showing it repeatedly would prove her point, but her tactics backfired. The meeting turned contentious, with dozens of homeowners standing up to share their own stories of unreasonable enforcement actions. One man, a lawyer himself, pointed out that Patricia had selectively enforced rules, ignoring violations by her friends while hammering others for minor issues. Another woman revealed that Patricia had threatened to fine her for having the wrong color flowers in her garden. The election itself was packed. Nearly 200 homeowners showed up, an unprecedented turnout for an HOA vote. The bylaws required a simple majority of those voting to recall a board member. When the votes were counted, Patricia was recalled by a margin of 168 to 34. Harold and Denise, reading the room, both resigned on the spot. Tom, Gloria, and a retired accountant named Frank Yates were elected to fill the 3 board positions. Their first official act was to pass a resolution implementing a new enforcement policy that emphasized education and cooperation over fines, required board approval before any fine over $100 could be issued, and established an appeals process for homeowners to challenge violations. Their second act was to formally recognize my shed as a historic structure and an example of 1960s craftsmanship, noting it in the HOA records as a protected grandfathered building. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong again. On a Thursday afternoon in late June, I got a call from Tom. "You need to come to the community center right now," he said, his voice tight with anger. "What's going on? Just come. You need to see this." I drove over, finding Tom, Gloria, and Frank in the HOA office, a small room in the community center building. Tom's laptop was open on the desk, showing a spreadsheet. "We've been going through the HOA financial records," Tom explained. "Patricia was supposed to turn everything over when she left the board, but she dragged her feet. We finally got access to the bank accounts today." "And?" I prompted. Gloria, her face pale, said, "Money's missing. A lot of money." Frank, the accountant, turned the laptop so I could see. The HOA should have approximately $187,000 in reserves based on dues collected and normal operating expenses. The account has $94,000. "Could it have been spent on something legitimate?" I asked. "That's what we thought at first," Frank said. "But look at this." He clicked through to another screen showing a series of checks. "These are made out to something called Meadowbrook Property Management Services. They total $93,000 over the past 9 months, supposedly for management consulting services." Tom crossed his arms. "We called the company. It doesn't exist. The checks were all signed by Patricia." My stomach dropped. "She embezzled from the HOA. It looks that way," Gloria said quietly. "We've contacted the HOA's attorney, and he's recommending we file a police report." "We wanted to tell you first," Tom added, "because you were her primary target. We think she was using the violation fines as a way to funnel more money into the account so the missing funds wouldn't be as obvious. If she could collect a few thousand here and there from fines, it would help cover the gap." It all made sense now. The aggressive enforcement, the bogus violations, the refusal to back down even when she was clearly wrong. Patricia had been trying to generate fine revenue to hide her theft. My shed had become a target not because of any genuine concern about regulations, but because she needed money and thought she could bully me into paying. "File the report," I said. "This is fraud." Tom nodded. "We're going to the police station after this. The attorney says we have a solid case. There's a clear paper trail, and the checks were forged or fraudulent." The next morning, 2 detectives from the Boulder Police Department showed up at Patricia's house. I heard about it from my neighbor across the street, who had watched as Patricia was escorted out in handcuffs. The sight of her being arrested became neighborhood legend within hours. The investigation moved quickly. Patricia had been sloppy in her theft, apparently thinking nobody would closely examine the HOA finances. She had created a fake business name, opened a bank account in that name, and written checks from the HOA account to herself. The money had gone toward credit card debt, online shopping, and a trip to Hawaii she had claimed was for an HOA conference. She was charged with felony theft, forgery, and embezzlement. Her attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the district attorney's office was unsympathetic. The case went to trial 4 months later in October. I attended the trial, sitting in the gallery with Tom, Gloria, Frank, and about a dozen other neighbors who had been targeted by Patricia's enforcement schemes. The prosecution laid out the evidence methodically. The fake company, the forged checks, the missing money, expert testimony from forensic accountants showing exactly how Patricia had structured the theft. Patricia's defense was that she had intended to pay the money back, and that the stress of her position had caused her to make poor decisions. It was not a compelling argument. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. At sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge gave Patricia 4 years in state prison, along with an order to make full restitution to the HOA. Her husband, who filed for divorce while the trial was ongoing, was not implicated in the theft and cooperated with investigators. Standing outside the courthouse after sentencing, Tom turned to me. "Never thought an HOA dispute would end with someone going to prison." "Neither did I admitted. "I just wanted to keep my grandfather's shed." "Well, you did that," Gloria said with a small smile. "And you helped expose someone who was stealing from all of us." The HOA, under its new leadership, became a different organization. Tom, Gloria, and Frank focused on maintaining the neighborhood without aggressive enforcement. Fines became rare, usually reserved for truly egregious violations like someone leaving a broken-down car on their lawn for months. The emphasis shifted to building community rather than punishing minor infractions. In November, the HOA held its annual Fall Festival, a tradition that had lapsed under Patricia's presidency. I volunteered to help set up, and on the morning of the event, Tom asked me to bring some of my grandfather's old woodworking projects from the shed to display. I set up a table with a rocking chair my grandfather had built in 1967, a jewelry box from the 1970s, and the dollhouse from the 1980s. Next to them, I placed a framed photo of my grandfather in his shed, taken sometime in the late 1990s, showing him surrounded by his tools and projects, a satisfied smile on his weathered face. Throughout the day, neighbors stopped by to admire the craftsmanship and share their own memories of my grandfather. Several older residents remembered him well, talking about how he had helped them with home repairs or built custom furniture for them. One man told me my grandfather had helped him build a deck in 1978, teaching him carpentry skills he still used. "Your grandfather was the kind of neighbor everyone should have," the man said. "Always willing to help, never asking for anything in return. That shed was his pride and joy. He'd be proud you fought to keep it." As the festival wound down that evening, I stood in my backyard looking at the shed in the fading light. It was just a building, wood and nails and shingles, but it represented something more. A connection to my family's history, a testament to craftsmanship and care, and now a reminder that standing up for what's right matters, even when it's difficult. The legal bills from Sarah Chen had been substantial, several $1,000s I hadn't planned on spending. But the new HOA board, after recovering the stolen funds from Patricia's assets, voted to reimburse me from the HOA treasury, recognizing that my fight had helped expose the larger fraud. More than that, though, the whole experience had changed how I saw the neighborhood. What had felt like just a place I inherited had become a community I was invested in. I knew my neighbors now, not just their faces but their stories. We had been through something together, fighting against someone who abused her position, and we had come out stronger. In December, the first snow fell, dusting the shed's cedar shake roof with white. I went out there on a Saturday morning, fired up the wood stove my grandfather had installed decades ago, and spent a few hours working on a project of my own. a set of bookshelves for my living room. As I measured and cut and sanded, I thought about my grandfather working in this same space, using these same tools, and I felt connected to him in a way I hadn't since he passed. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom. Board meeting Tuesday, 7 p.m. Need to approve next year's budget. Also discussing the idea of creating a neighborhood history committee to document stories and preserve significant structures. Interested, I typed back. I'll be there. The shed had stood for nearly 60 years, weathering storms and seasons, a testament to quality construction and regular care. It would stand for many more, protected now not just by law, but by a community that understood the value of history and the importance of preserving what came before. As I worked, I heard kids playing in the street outside, their laughter carrying on the cold air. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A car pulled into a driveway, someone coming home. These were the sounds of a neighborhood alive and thriving, not paralyzed by petty rules and fear of fines. Patricia Morrison's attempt to force me to tear down my grandfather's shed had failed spectacularly. Not only was the shed still standing, it was now formally recognized and protected. More than that, her overreach had led to her own downfall and the transformation of the HOA into something better. There's a lesson in that, I thought, running my hand along the smooth surface of the workbench my grandfather had built. Bullies eventually meet people who won't back down. Thieves eventually get caught. And communities eventually find their way to the leaders they deserve. The bookshelves were coming along nicely. I worked through the afternoon, stopping only to grab a sandwich and coffee. By evening, I had the frame assembled and was working on the adjustable shelving. It felt good to create something with my hands, to follow in my grandfather's footsteps. Around 6 o'clock, my phone rang. It was Sarah Chen. Bernard, I wanted to let you know that Patricia Morrison's restitution payments have started. The HOA received the first installment today. Also, her attorney contacted me. She wanted me to pass along that she's sorry for what she put you through. Do you think she means it? I asked. Does it matter? She's in prison, you won. The shed's protected. Sometimes that's all the closure you get. She was right, of course. I thanked her for calling and hung up. The apology, if it was genuine, didn't change anything. The important thing was that justice had been served, the HOA had recovered its stolen funds, and the neighborhood was moving forward. As winter deepened, I made the shed a regular retreat. I built a coffee table, repaired some old chairs I had found at a garage sale, and started work on a chest of drawers. Word got around the neighborhood that I was doing woodworking, and I started getting requests. Nothing major, just small projects. A custom picture frame here, a repaired table there, a toy box for someone's grandchild. I never charged much, just enough to cover materials. It wasn't about the money. It was about keeping the tradition alive, honoring my grandfather's memory by using the skills he had taught me and sharing them with others. In February, the HOA newsletter included a feature article about the shed, complete with photos from different eras and quotes from longtime residents about my grandfather. Tom had written it, and it concluded with a paragraph that made me unexpectedly emotional. The shed at 847 Oakwood Drive stands as a reminder that our neighborhood has a history worth preserving, that the people who came before us built things to last, and that sometimes the old ways have value we shouldn't be too quick to discard. It also reminds us that standing up for what's right, even against opposition, is how communities improve and grow stronger. That spring, I planted a garden around the shed, using landscaping plans I found in my grandfather's papers. He had apparently designed but never completed a border of native Colorado plants, columbines, penstemon, and Indian paintbrush. I spent weekends preparing the soil, setting stones for borders and planting seedlings. My neighbor helped, bringing over extra plants and advice. We worked in comfortable silence most of the time, occasionally talking about the weather, work, or neighborhood gossip. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in the chaos of the previous year. By June, the garden was thriving, bright spots of color surrounding the weathered cedar of the shed. The HOA newsletter featured it again, this time in a piece about native landscaping. Tom joked that I had become the neighborhood celebrity, but I knew the attention wasn't really about me. It was about what the shed represented: continuity, craftsmanship, community, and the idea that new isn't always better. On a warm evening in July, I hosted a barbecue in my backyard. Tom and his family came, along with Gloria, Frank, and about 20 other neighbors. Kids ran around playing tag while adults talked and laughed, gathered around the grill and the picnic tables I had built in the shed. As the sun set and fireflies emerged, someone asked me to tell the story of the shed and the battle with Patricia Morrison. I resisted at first, not wanting to rehash the drama, but people insisted. So I told it, starting with that Tuesday afternoon when Patricia had marched across my lawn with her clipboard, and ending with her conviction and imprisonment. When I finished, there was a moment of silence before someone started clapping. Others joined in, and suddenly everyone was applauding. I felt my face flush, uncomfortable with the attention. "You did what a lot of us wish we'd had the courage to do," Gloria said. "You stood up to a bully. And because you did, all of us are better off." "I was just trying to protect my grandfather's shed," I said. "And that's exactly the point," Tom added. "You were protecting something that mattered. That's always worth fighting for." The party continued into the night, people lingering until nearly midnight. As I cleaned up afterward, picking up paper plates and empty bottles, I reflected on how much had changed in a little over a year. I had gone from a guy just trying to keep his head down and live quietly in his inherited house to someone connected to his community, someone people looked to as an example of standing up for what's right. It was a responsibility I hadn't asked for, but one I was learning to accept. In August, the HOA held elections for board positions. Tom, Gloria, and Frank all ran for re-election and won easily. A fourth position opened up when another board member moved out of state, and several people approached me about running. I thought about it for a week before deciding to throw my hat in the ring. The election was uncontested. Apparently, my story had given me enough credibility that nobody wanted to run against me. In September, I attended my first board meeting not as a resident with a complaint, but as a board member with responsibility for helping guide the neighborhood. It was strange sitting at the front table instead of in the audience, but it felt right. We discussed mundane matters: approving a contract for snow removal, reviewing the budget for holiday decorations, addressing a legitimate complaint about a neighbor who was running an unlicensed auto repair business out of his garage. The last item caught my attention. "What do we do about something like that?" I asked. Tom explained. "First, we talk to them. Explain the issue, see if we can work it out. If it's a zoning violation, which this probably is, we might need to refer it to the county. But we approach it as neighbors trying to solve a problem together, not as authorities looking to punish someone." That philosophy guided our decisions throughout the fall. We dealt with issues as they arose, but always with an emphasis on communication and cooperation rather than fines and enforcement. It wasn't always easy. Some people pushed back against any oversight at all. But overall, the neighborhood responded well to the approach. In November, the annual Fall Festival returned, bigger than the year before. This time, I didn't just display my grandfather's projects. I held a woodworking demonstration in my backyard, showing kids how to safely use tools and make simple projects like birdhouses and picture frames. More than 30 children participated throughout the day, and several parents asked if I'd consider teaching a regular class. That winter, I started a monthly workshop in my garage, teaching basic woodworking to anyone interested. Sometimes I had 2 students, sometimes 10. Ages ranged from teenagers to retirees. I charged nothing, asking only that students bring their own materials for projects. The shed became a lending library of sorts, with tools available for borrowing and a growing collection of reference books and project plans. One Saturday in December, a kid named Marcus, maybe 13 years old, showed up for the workshop. He was quiet and seemed nervous around the tools, but he watched everything intently. Over the next few months, he became a regular, showing up early and staying late. Absorbing everything I taught him. In March, he brought me a jewelry box he had made on his own time. It was rough around the edges, the joints not quite perfect, the finish a little uneven. But it was good work, especially for a beginner. "This is really impressive, Marcus," I said, examining it carefully. "Who's it for?" "My mom's birthday," he said. "She's always wanted something handmade. She's going to love it. You should be proud of this." He smiled, a shy but genuine expression. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why do you do this? Teach people for free, I mean." I thought about it for a moment. "My grandfather taught me woodworking in that shed out back. He never charged me anything. He just wanted to pass along what he knew. I guess I'm doing the same thing. Skills like this, they're worth preserving and sharing." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "My dad says you fought the HOA to keep that shed." "I did." "That's pretty cool. Standing up for what matters, I mean." "Sometimes you have to," I said. "Not everything, not every battle is worth fighting. But when it's something important, something that connects you to people you love or represents something bigger than yourself, then yeah, you stand up." That conversation stuck with me. I realized I wasn't just teaching woodworking. I was passing along something my grandfather had given me. The idea that making things with your hands matters, that craftsmanship has value, that preserving history and tradition is worth the effort. By the time spring arrived again, 2 years after Patricia Morrison had first appeared on my porch with her clipboard, the neighborhood felt transformed. Not in physical appearance, the houses looked much the same, the streets unchanged. But the atmosphere was different. People knew each other. They looked out for one another. The HOA was a tool for maintaining shared spaces and addressing genuine problems, not a weapon for enforcing conformity. And the shed, my grandfather's shed, still stood solid and strong in my backyard, serving the same purpose it had for nearly 60 years. A place to create, to build, to pass along skills and knowledge to the next generation. On a warm afternoon in May, I was in the shed working on a rocking chair when I heard someone call my name. I looked up to see Tom standing in the doorway. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Sure, come in." He walked around the shed slowly, looking at the tools and projects in various stages of completion. "You know, I never really appreciated this place until everything happened with Patricia. Now I see why you fought so hard for it." "It's just a building," I said. "No, it's not. It's a piece of history. It's a connection to the past and a bridge to the future. It's all those kids you're teaching, all the projects people make here. It's proof that some things are worth preserving." I set down the sandpaper I'd been using. "What brings you by?" "The board wants to establish a program to identify and protect other historical structures in the neighborhood. Make sure what happened with your shed doesn't happen to other places. We'd like you to head it up." "Me? You're the obvious choice." You understand the importance of these things and you've already been through the legal process. Will you do it? I looked around the shed, at the space my grandfather had created and that I had fought to preserve. Yeah, I said, I'll do it. Over the next few months, I worked with the board to develop guidelines for identifying and protecting historically significant structures in Meadowbrook Hills. We found 17 buildings that predated the HOA, including 4 sheds, 2 original garages, and even one house that dated back to 1958. Each was documented, photographed, and formally recognized by the board. The program got attention beyond our neighborhood. A local preservation society invited me to speak about it, and a newspaper ran a feature article. Other HOAs started asking how they could implement similar programs. What had started as a fight to protect one shed had grown into something larger, a movement to balance preservation with progress. In July, 2 years and change after the whole thing started, I received a letter from the Colorado Historical Society. They had heard about the shed and the preservation program and wanted to add my grandfather's shed to the State Register of Historical Places. It wasn't a huge honor, but it was official recognition that the shed had cultural and historical significance beyond just my family. The ceremony was small, held in my backyard on a Saturday afternoon. A representative from the Historical Society gave a brief speech about the importance of preserving mid-century structures and the craftsmanship they represented. They presented me with a plaque to mount on the shed, designating it as a recognized historical structure. Afterward, standing in front of the shed with the plaque in my hands, I thought about everything that had happened. A simple building, constructed by my grandfather in 1965, had become the center of a battle that exposed fraud, transformed an HOA, brought a community together, and inspired a preservation program that was helping other neighborhoods. My grandfather would have found the whole thing ridiculous and wonderful at the same time. He had built the shed as a practical workspace, nothing more. He would have been baffled that anyone would try to tear it down and amazed that it ended up on a historical register. But I think he also would have been proud, not of the recognition or the drama, but of the fact that the shed was still being used for its intended purpose, creating things, teaching skills, bringing people together. That's what he had always cared about, the practical application of knowledge and the passing down of traditions. As the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across my backyard, I looked at the shed with new eyes. It wasn't just a building anymore if it ever had been. It was a symbol of standing up for what matters, of fighting for principle rather than convenience, of preserving the past while building the future. And it was still, at its heart, just a place to make things with your hands, to learn and teach and create. That simplicity, that fundamental purpose, was what made it worth protecting. The next morning, Marcus showed up for an unscheduled visit. "I brought my little brother," he said, gesturing to a boy of about 10 standing shyly behind him. "He wants to learn woodworking too." "Come on in," I said, opening the shed door wide. "We're always happy to have new students." As I taught the 2 boys how to measure and cut wood for a simple box project, I realized this was the real victory. Not the legal battle, not the recognition, not even the preservation program. The real victory was that my grandfather's shed would continue serving its purpose for another generation, that the skills and values he had passed down would keep moving forward. Patricia Morrison was in prison, serving her sentence for fraud and embezzlement. The HOA had recovered its stolen funds and reformed its policies. The neighborhood was stronger and more connected. And the shed, the grandfathered structure from the 1960s that had started it all, stood as solid as the day my grandfather built it, still legal, still standing, still serving the community. That was the story people would remember, not the drama or the conflict, but the enduring value of craftsmanship, community, and standing up for what matters. In the end, that's what the shed represented, and that's why it was worth fighting for. Every nail, every board, every tool hanging on the wall told the story of my grandfather's dedication and skill. And now it told my story too. The story of refusing to back down, of protecting what matters, of honoring the past while building the future. The shed would stand for decades more, I had no doubt, weathering whatever storms came its way, both literal and figurative. A testament to the idea that some things are built to last, and some fights are worth winning.